Thank you very much, and I greatly appreciate the fact that you sustained the applause during all the time it took to get up here, because it could be very anticlimactic if it had all died away before I arrived. And thank you also for that exceedingly kind and generous introduction. I've been introduced before, but seldom so eloquently, and felt so appreciated in all my nuances. So thank you very much. This place is sort of my spiritual home, Iowa City. So I come here every chance I get. And on my little self-financed book tour, using air miles and staying with friends, because I learned that now you can do this on the internet and you don't have to leave home, which I think is one of the problems with the internet, is that you don't leave any place. But anyway, this is my first memoir. I wrote it while I was young enough to remember everything. And even though I say at the beginning that eyewitnesses, cops and lawyers will tell you are the worst, the least reliable witnesses. And this is an eyewitness account. So make of that what you will. People say, why did you write this memoir? And I quote Dr. Johnson said that a man is a blockhead who writes for any reason except money. The Writers Guild went on strike last January. We were not allowed to write screenplays. So I had to do something to make some money, because I have kids who are still in school. So my agent said, why don't you write your memoirs? There's a funny line in Ninotchka, which is a movie that I really love, where Melvin Douglas turns to Ina Claire, who's the Grand Duchess Swana in exile from Russia, and he says, darling, he says, I'm selling your autobiography. We won't have to worry about our future if you let me raffle off your past. Life and Loves of the Grand Duchess Swana. So think of this as my slightly cleaned up version of Life and Loves. Problem with discussing your memoir is that everything you say, you're giving something away, because I put a lot of things in it. So I won't give you a lot more of that. I'll do a reading, a section of reading. When I see people's eyes glaze over, I'll know that it's time to stop. I always read too short, I'm told, because I keep being afraid that there's a man with a hook who will come out, and I don't want that to happen. And what I thought I would read, with some elisions, which is not a place where they have fields, but actually, thank you, is I thought I would read not from the Star Trek portion of the book, but about the making of The Day After, just as a kind of sobering change of pace and to establish my gravitas, which is not a Scandinavian fish. So I'll read you a little section about this. I may skip around to the funny parts, because if you can find funny parts in The Day After, you're doing good. And I had finished Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and there was a movie that I still wanted to make called Conjuring. I'll read and see how long my voice lasts. Is this a glass of water? Is that what this is? Oh, good, because I thought it might be, something preserved in brine. Someone said that Hollywood is like an extension of high school. I am not sure exactly what this means, but I do acknowledge the place's stratified aspects, among which is the difference between having a hit and having a flop. With the success of The Wrath of Khan, I was suddenly popular. If Time After Time had registered in the town's eyes as a succès d'estime, The Wrath of Khan was just a big, fat hit, and it catapulted me into the banks of bankable directors. It was time, I thought, to get back to Conjuring, which was my film adaptation of Robertson Davies' novel Fifth Business. which I spent 16 years trying to make into a film. But that was still not happening, and for the life of me, I couldn't understand why. Hadn't I, quote, made one for them, end quote? And from my perspective, more to the point, what was wrong with Conjuring? People always began their response by telling me how well written it was. It took me years to figure out this was not a compliment. They were taking shelter behind it's well written. Well written is, these are beautiful blueprints, but I don't intend to build this house. When somebody tells you your screenplay is so well written, that's the kiss of death. Well written is code for, I don't love you. Normally, when someone says, I don't love you, you don't find yourself asking, why? But when it's your script instead of you, the temptation to masochistically pursue this absence of love is well nigh irresistible. Now you're really pressing people to the wall. Most of the time, who knows why someone doesn't love someone? In the case of Conjuring, people said they couldn't tell if it was commercial, quote, end quote. To which I always responded, how can you tell if something's commercial until it's made a ton of money? Be reasonable, people. If you knew what commercial was, all films would make millions. And beggars would live in princes' palaces. But it's a crapshoot every time. Why are you always trying to figure out what the people want instead of figuring out what you think is terrific? I always seem to get into this pissing match of unprovables. I was once talking to someone about the movie business, and when I pointed out that Romeo and Juliet had always been a hit despite the fact that the lovers die in the end, he responded, it would have been an even bigger hit if they'd lived. In the midst of a period of what Variety would call mulling offers then, ABC gave me the opportunity to direct the day after a TV movie about a nuclear holocaust written by Ed Hume. I was the fourth director to be offered the script, and I could see why others had turned it down. Who wanted to learn about this god-awful stuff? The great and terrible paradox about the nuclear issue is that while it remains the single most important dilemma, arguably laterally twined with global warming, to confront the human race, it is at the same time so dreadful that no one in his right mind can bear to contemplate it. Like most people, I preferred to avoid the entire terrifying topic. What sort of person willingly immerses himself in the prospect of nuclear annihilation? Everyone knows the bombs are out there, Damoclean swords dangling over our necks, and that knowledge, semi-consciously carried around inside our heads, is more than sufficient for most of us. As it happened during this heady time of professional success, I was being psychoanalyzed. Still. I spent a lot of time on the couch and elsewhere trying to rationalize my way out of doing this movie. I could think of endless reasons. My analyst was Dr. Louis J. Fielding, famous at the time for having his office burgled by Nixon's plumbers in search of dirt to use on another of his patients, Daniel Ellsberg, in the hopes of discrediting the Pentagon Papers he had secretly photocopied from the Rand Corporation and given to the New York Times. When I first began my analysis, I wasted a lot of Fielding's time, and my own, making nervous jokes revolving around my anxiety of following in Ellsberg's footsteps. "Look, Doc, I've brought you the Pentagon Papers." "Interesting," he responded to my chagrin. "You know, you're the second guy today who's trooped into my office with these." Under normal circumstances, Fielding seldom spoke other than to recapitulate or string together my associations at the end of the hour. But on the occasion of my day after soul-searching, he surprised me by interrupting my monologue. "I think," he suggested quietly, "that this is where we find out who you really are." Which is one of the most dreadful and useful things anyone has ever said to me. I knew the moment the words were out of his mouth that I would have to direct the day after. I had entered psychoanalysis to find out who I was, and now I was going to. It wasn't all that easy rounding up people to be in the movie or work on it either. Everyone was as spooked as I was. When I approached Gain Rescher, my cinematographer from Star Trek II, and asked him to photograph the movie, he said he wasn't up for it. "You mean," I badgered, "that you prefer to sit around at dinner parties and bitch about the state of the world, but when someone offers you the chance to put your work in the service of your beliefs, you're going to turn it down?" He frowned unhappily. "I think," I pressed shamelessly on, "that this is where we find out who you really are." Damn useful, that phrase. I crowbarred a lot of people with it. Jason Robards didn't need that kind of pressure. I'd met him once at a friend's house and now bumped into him on a flight to New York. I can't say it wasn't a thrill to chat with the man. By way of making small talk, Robards asked me what I was up to. I told him I would be shooting a film that summer in Lawrence, Kansas about nuclear war. Really. Suddenly I was seized by a weird impulse. We were at 36,000 feet with no TV executives or agents in sight. "So, Jason, what are you doing this August?" Maybe it had some cognac. I can't remember now. "Not a thing." "Would you like to be in this movie?" "Beats signing petitions," he answered without hesitation. I promised to show him Ed Hume's compelling script when we landed. As it happened, ABC wasn't too bent out of shape by my hiring one of the best American actors of his generation, but my relations with them and with the television in general were congenitally stormy. Brandon Stoddard was the head of ABC Circle Films, the branch of the corporation that was going to make the movie, which was in fact his idea, apparently inspired by his having viewed the nuclear-themed feature The China Syndrome. Stoddard had an assistant whom I shall refer to as X. In the original draft of the book, I referred to him as Duh. That's not in the thing. You know it, and I know. When X first showed me the script and asked me to direct the film, it was planned as a 4-hour event to be spread over 2 nights. The screenplay I read, while undeniably powerful, seemed also to be padded. I figured you could shake an hour out of it easily, and the material would benefit from being tightened. "Why don't you whack an hour out of this thing, do it all in one night, and zap the audience right between the eyes?" I suggested to X. "I don't believe folks are going to tune in for night 2 of Armageddon." "You're right about the script being padded," X conceded, "but what you don't understand is the economics of TV. ABC does not expect to make any money on the day after, but there is a limit on how much we can afford to lose. The hour that you propose to eliminate represents essential advertising for us. Those 4 hours literally translate into 3 hours of film, 90 minutes a night, and 30 minutes of advertising." "Ah. So you see," went on X, who always spoke as though he saw himself explaining things to a child, and who knows, "we need the film time to justify the revenue." "Aha. Let me ask you something else," I pursued. "You don't really think you're going to get this thing on the air, do you? I mean, the American people watch Charlie's Angels. They're not prepared to be exposed to anything like this." "Oh, it'll go on the air all right," prophesied X blithely. The producer of The Day After was a genial, unpretentious fellow named Bob Papazian, who knew as much about television movies as anyone in the business. He had produced some excellent prestige movies about such things as the federal desegregation of Little Rock Central High, and would later go on to manage the impossible logistics of North and South Book 2 fighting the entire Civil War in about a week. I liked him, he liked me. We've been friends ever since. What intrigued me about the script of The Day After was its seductive banality. It was just a TV movie about average Americans going about business as usual until they get fried. Since Americans, and for all I know everyone else as well, are constitutionally incapable of reading the anti-nuclear books and articles or watching the alarmist TV documentaries, or were equally unwilling to watch such nuclear-themed movies as On the Beach, I had the idea that maybe the comforting familiarity of our script might work for us, would enable the film to sneak in the back door of everyone's consciousness, so to speak, in the guise of the good old reliable movie of the week. I knew, however, that whatever its soap opera camouflage, the day after was no movie of the week. Like Stoddard and X, Bob Papazian also seemed to be unable to appreciate what was so clear to me from the beginning, namely the political, financial, and psychological impossibility represented by the film as a project for American network television. When I tried to explain my fears, Papazian just laughed. His laugh, like Bill Dornish, who was my editor, whom I'd also cajoled into editing this film, was another sort of high-pitched giggle. Like, you remember Richard Widmark as, what is his name, Johnny Udo in Kiss of Death. Nonetheless, we got along splendidly and went to work preparing the project. I'd crossed the bridge of the padded script somehow when I got to it. And I'm skipping a little bit here, but I had yet to cope with the Byzantine politics that characterizes network television. To take but one example, Bob announced to me one day that we had a meeting to attend. "What meeting?" I asked as we got into his car. "Standards and practices," he answered as we pulled out of the garage. "Standards and practices," I echoed. "What is that?" Bob defined standards and practices. My eyes widened. "Censors! You're describing censors!" I shrieked as we squeaked west on Pico Boulevard toward ABC corporate offices in Century City. "Well, they call it standards and practices," Bob explained with one of his giggles. I mulled at this. "What happens when we get there?" I asked. "Well, you go through the script and they tell you what you can't film. You can argue about some stuff," he added, casting me a sideways look. I said nothing but cogitated some more as we drove on for 3 more traffic lights. I am not the fastest thinker in the world, but I was slowly coming to the conclusion that I had been blindsided. Bushwhacked. Ambushed. "Bob!" "Uh-huh." "Let me ask you something." "Shoot." "If they were going to censor this script, wouldn't it have been more appropriate to censor it before I was offered it to direct?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, you guys showed me a script, and I agreed to direct this script. Now I find out that some people can take it apart before I ever roll the camera. Seems to me, if they'd wanted to tone it down, they should have done that before I agreed to direct it." "This is how it's always done," Bob explained, puzzled. I thought about this as we headed into the ABC garage. "Bob," still here, Nick, "I just want to say I can't be honor-bound by anything that happens in this meeting." Nervous guffaw from Bob. "Hey, take it easy. I'm just telling you. This, I hefted my copy of the script. This is the script I agreed to shoot, nothing less." More uneasy laughter from Bob. The meeting was even stranger than I had imagined. A man and woman who never smiled went through our script page by page. On page 2, the woman indicated, where the patient calls his Japanese doctor Tojo, that's out. "How come?" I found myself asking, despite myself. "Because the term is racially offensive to Japanese viewers, and we will not knowingly insult a portion of our viewing public." "Did you ever make a film and use the term nigger?" I asked. "Never." "Didn't you make a miniseries called Roots?" I pursued. "Seems to me the term nigger was all over the place." "Yes," admitted the man, "but that was in context." "What does that mean, in context? Means it was about niggers?" They shifted in their seats. To my left, Bob squirmed. "It's out," the woman said flatly. "Completely," added the other. I said nothing. Later on, they objected to a scene where one of the characters purchases a diaphragm. "How come?" I replied, dutifully maintaining my prescribed part of the exchange, as ritualistic as the responses of the congregation. "They seem to expect it. Because the network will not take a position that could be construed as endorsing birth control." It took another kind of control to just sit there. Where do people come from who do this job? Do they have childhoods like the rest of us? Go to school, get drunk, laugh, laid, cry? Or are they born Athena-like, full-blown from the head of some executive? You mean, they say that, fun is the past tense of shit. You mean you guys never made a film where birth control devices were used or discussed? Never. And you make a film about teenage pregnancy a year or so back? Seems like all sorts of talk about diaphragms and pills and such. Yes, but that was in context. I finished. Anyway, I reasoned, unable to stop myself from engaging in this discourse any more than I could prevent myself from debating with the Jehovah's Witnesses who knocked on my dorm room door in college. This character later bitterly regrets having used a diaphragm. That certainly would seem to be the opposite of an endorsement of birth control. It's out completely. I said nothing. And so it went. Where nuclear war was concerned, they also objected to scenes that depicted the electromagnetic pulse and its consequences. They were scientific experts now. We found ourselves arguing over scientific data none of us was qualified to evaluate. They told me the EMP was out. I said nothing, but sat with the script in my lap, making not a single note. Bob was writing stuff down, but for the life of me, I couldn't see why. Later, filming in Lawrence, Kansas, I ignored every one of their directives. Matters came to a head about 10 days into shooting. We were filming one of the family subplots which took place while the United States and the Russians were getting ready to launch their missiles when I got tapped on the shoulder by Bob. "There's a call for you from L.A. Can you take a message?" Shook his head. "It's the ABC brass." I took the phone. The voice on the other end was apoplectic. He was on a speakerphone, and I sensed a bunch of other execs in the room with him. "Nick, what do you think you're doing?" "Shooting the script you offered me to direct." "But we agreed. You agreed," the voice expostulated. "I agreed to nothing," I pointed out, having been waiting for this moment, "except to shoot the script you offered me." But rather than have this discussion, I went on by way of preempting his next expostulation. "Let me make this easy for you. Fire me." "What?" "Fire me. I didn't want to make this depressing movie anyway. Fire me and I'll have a perfect out." "You're kidding." "Not me. Look, you're only 10 days in. It shouldn't be too hard to reshoot. You get a new director and some new actors." "New actors?" "Well, if I walk, Jason's going to walk. Maybe Jo Beth Williams, too. But that shouldn't be a problem," I hastened to assure him, warming to my topic. "You just replace Jason, replace Jo Beth, replace Gain Resher, and before you know it, you'll be—" "Hang on." I could hear mumbling voices and thought I caught the phrase, "that son of a bitch," before my correspondent got back on the line. "Nick, we'll get back to you." "Do that." The next day the phone rang again, this time in a Kansas farmhouse where we were shooting. This time the voice, the same voice, crooned with patronizing serenity, "Nick, it's your movie. Shoot it the way you want, but as an officer of ABC Circle Films, I must tell you that legally none of that stuff can be in the picture." "Fine, you've told me." And there that particular brouhaha ended. In the event, not one of the items I shot was deleted, including the celebrated diaphragm and the scenes involving the effect of the electromagnetic pulse, which depicted all electricity cutting out in the wake of an airborne nuclear explosion. Now, I don't know if I should stop or if I should keep going, or if the man with the hook or falling asleep or whatever. Should I stop? I'll read a little bit more of it and then I'll stop. Following the shootout with the network, actual shooting, first in Lawrence, Kansas, and later in an abandoned L.A. hospital. Some of this reads funny to me. I can't help it. And later at an abandoned L.A. hospital went very well. For all the bad rap Kansas has garnered in recent years, what with trying to turn back the clock on Darwin, the people of Lawrence were as sophisticated as any I've ever met, and they came out by the thousands to make the film work and achieve a scale it could otherwise never have afforded. Now, granted, some of these folks were just there because the idea of being in a movie struck them as fun, but I talked to a large number who had come out of political conviction and genuine concern at the prospect of a nuclear war. The day after is dedicated to them. The night the film aired, they held a candlelight vigil for peace in Lawrence that hundreds attended. 25 years later, at an anniversary reunion and screening in Lawrence, which was last October, I was there, and people showed up. They were not movie freaks. They were peace junkies. There were other problems, however. When it came time to edit the film, I was confronted with the hours' worth of padding in the script. I had never edited scenes to length before, and the process as well as the concept I found confounding. Why should a scene play longer than it could justify itself on the screen? I placed a call to X. "Listen, X," I said, "I know that you want this film for 2 nights, but candidly, I think it will be significantly weakened if we keep in all this extra stuff. I believe in putting my best foot forward and making the best possible impression on you guys that I can. Can't I edit the film the way I think it should go, and then if you still want the rest back in, we can restore it?" "I'll get back to you," said X. They always say you'll get back to you. A day later, he called. "We too believe in the doctrine of first impressions," said X. "Edit the film your way, and we'll look at it." I was astonished at his response, which only made sense when I later learned how difficult it had become for ABC to get any sponsors for the film. As I had anticipated, the political landscape was beginning to register seismic tremors, and the withdrawal of sponsors was one of the earliest manifestations of the difficulties we were to have broadcasting the day after. General Motors, General Mills, General Foods, all the generals had headed for the hills. Certainly if ABC couldn't get advertisers, it made no sense to stretch out the movie beyond a single night. In the end, my hatred for the commercials that insistently interrupt network television and my dream that they might magically be dispensed with was gratified. The only advertisers to hang in were Commodore Computers and one of the smaller car rental companies. Tactfully, the network decided to have no commercials after the bomb dropped. I wondered if their tact would have obtained if they'd been getting prime rates, and so on, and so on, and so forth.
Time for some questions?
Oh, sure. Ask away.
I was going to say, let the Star Trek questions begin. Does anyone have a question straight off the bat? If not, I'll start. Great.
Nick, is there the possibility of a rerun?
Of The Day After?
Yeah.
The Day After is, available on DVD. And what's more, that version is represents a lot more of my cut than what actually ultimately made it onto television. Secondly, The Day After has been rerun, and they've cut it, this time not for censorship reasons, but simply to fit it into one of their time slots now that the commercials are back in. When people complained about this, Brandon Stoddard said, "Well, it really wasn't that good of a movie anyway." So you could, if you want to get it, you get it on DVD or Netflix or something like that.
Have you seen the new Star Trek film, and what do you think of it?
I have seen the new Star Trek film. I thought it was a very efficient piece of work of rebooting the franchise and sort of laying it all out, and I wished I'd had all those bells and whistles to play with. Why is it that when you bat cleanup, it's these tiny little budgets? Anyway, so in that sense, I admired it and I enjoyed it. I would also be less than candid if I said I didn't always understand it, or sometimes thematically what it was about, other than rebooting the franchise and connecting the dots, which I think it did very well. And I thought the first 5 minutes were amazing, and that's where I was really moved. I was moved by the birth of Kirk. They kind of lost me when he drove over a cliff in Iowa. But I think that it's a fun movie. I have to say that I've known J.J. Abrams since I attended his bar mitzvah. And he came up to me a little while ago and he said, "You know, you gave me a great gift. You gave me the annotated Sherlock Holmes for my bar mitzvah, and now my son is reading that." So that was a gift that kept on giving.
In all the time you've been working in Hollywood, glorious, neurotic Hollywood, what is the most positive development you've seen from the beginning of your career to the end of your career, and what's the most negative development you've seen in how Hollywood operates?
I don't think Hollywood is any more neurotic than any place else. It just has a bigger profile. The people there are just the same, except they're sort of in public. one of the themes of the book is that I would never have lasted as long as I did if I hadn't found it to be full of wonderful people. People who have put up with me, sustained me, held my hand, given me chances. It was like Iowa City. You come and you'll find your own place in the ocean, and you'll meet great people. You'll also meet terrible people. But Hollywood does not have a monopoly on bad behavior. It's going through a transition right now, which is awkward and complex. In the beginning, the people who made movies and who financed them were in love with movies. A lot of them were illiterate immigrants from Russia, and that it spoke to them as an international language, and they cared passionately about film. That's no longer the case. Those fiefdoms, those studios, those kingdoms have now been appropriated by gigantic corporations in which they simply are part of the debits and profits and loss statements on a ledger. They don't know about movies. They don't like movies. They're not interested. This is not a cynical, this is just a blunt reality. Now, it used to be that movies, you could make a movie about anything. I always say, because I like this movie, The Sundowners, and I think, well, if I went out today and said, I want to make this movie about sheep drovers in Australia, I think it's cool. That wouldn't happen. The Sundowners is not a movie that would get made today. What's happened is that individual stories and individual narrative has been replaced by demographic genre definitions. And you know what they are because you can't avoid them at the multiplex. You see the teenage slasher gore movie, the teenage gross-out comedy movie, the exploding car that turns into something else movie, and you don't fucking want to go. It's like, I'd rather stay home. And that's, to me, that staying home is a really sinister development. I can understand why it happens. But one of the things I talk about in this book, but you have to buy the book anyway because even though I just told you what it is that if you forfeit the communal experience, this experience, whether you're talking about church or opera or the movies or the theater or a concert, this miraculous thing that I believe is one of the key things that distinguishes us as human beings and as a civilization, the coming together, to have an experience which is simultaneously communal and also highly individual. That when you get to the end of a performance of Beethoven's Eroica and you applaud, you're not only applauding the composer, the orchestra, the conductor, this journey that you have all taken together. In a way, you're applauding yourself, too, which is justified. You have gone on this trip. And that's what happens in theater, and that's what happens in movies. And as I watch people disappearing into their own homes and jogging with the earbuds on, I'm thinking, you are shutting out life. You are shutting out the other. We're all going to turn into what Herman Melville called the isolatos. I don't think that's a good development. I think that Hollywood's in a period of transition, and at the end of the day, there may be another way to watch movies, but I don't want to see Lawrence of Arabia on my cell phone. I'm looking when I go for a theatrical experience, not only communal, and not only something figuratively larger than life, but literally larger than life. I had a friend who was at the writer's workshop when I was here, and he once said to me, "Do you know that Elizabeth Taylor is 5'1"? And I said, "Yeah, I do." And he said, "Well, I know it and you know it, but she's really, And we were movie struck, it's like that. Anyway. And somewhere in the back there is...
Given the struggles you had making the day after and some of the backlash you faced, what do you think about this recent, sort of recent post-Cold War slew of apocalyptic films like Independence Day and Armageddon and 2012 coming up, and their popularity now?
I don't entirely know what I think, except that when I read the New York Times review of The Day After Tomorrow, they which is not the sequel, they said basically that the movie played an apocalypse as a kind of amusement park thrill ride, and that it was a kick to use those special effects to see New York, as I'm sure a lot of people would like to, floated under water, and that in a way, movies do reflect what's going on, for better or worse. Whether they lead it or follow it is, sort of open to debate. But and I haven't seen the Cormac McCarthy movie. Is that The Road? Is that? Yeah, I haven't seen that yet, and so I don't know. But Apocalypse seems to be, at the moment, just another dramatic gimmick for the most part. I want to say one thing about The Day After, which I also say in the movie, in the book, but I didn't stop to read it. Making that movie was a counterintuitive exercise in the sense that people don't want to confront nuclear war. So I've made a movie about nuclear war. But I know the way the human mind works. They're going to do anything not to think about that. So if the acting is really good, they'll talk about how great the actor was. Jason Robards was incredible in that movie. It was so deep, and if the cinematography was too beautiful, they go, my God, did you see those Kansas fields with just waving wheat? And no, I didn't want that. Or there's the music. God, what a great score. Well, there is no music in The Day After. And I didn't want the movie to be a good movie because I didn't want people to talk about the movie. This is a hard decision for somebody who thinks of himself as any kind of artist to make. Don't make it good. Make it like a public service announcement, like Smokey the Bear. This is what happens if you have a forest fire. This is what it's going to look like. If you have nuclear war, this is what it's going to look like. There. Period. The end. When The Day After had all its advanced premiere and William Buckley and Phyllis Schlafly were running around like Chicken Little, and the New York Post was calling me a traitor in its editorial page. It was one of the greatest compliments I've ever... Did you know the New York Post was founded by Alexander Hamilton? Just think about that. The press ducked out on the movie. They got into who started the war. And that was all they wanted to talk about. That was their way of either selling newspapers or, again, ducking the issue. If you have a nuclear war, this is the optimist's version of what it's going to be like. But they still didn't want to discuss that. They want to talk about who started it. Was it us? Was it the Russians? So I think nowadays Apocalypse tends to be another, sort of plot possibility, which was perhaps inevitable.
Other questions?
A couple short ones. One, what's your take on product placement as a supplement to commercials? And two, what do you think the impact of the internet has been and will be over the next few years on what you've been talking about?
Product placement is kind of depressing to me, but movies are very expensive, and you look for ways to defray them. So if James Bond drives a certain car, wears a certain watch, I suppose this is inevitable. It did bug me, however, that when I made a comedy with John Candy and Tom Hanks called Volunteers, where somebody offers somebody else a Coke, they said that it was product placement. It was nothing of the kind. It was part of the plot, that this girl was in deepest Thailand, away from everything in America, and he said the magic word, have a Coke. It could have been anything else, but Coke seemed to be right. And then I was accused of product placement, which wasn't true. As far as the effects of the internet, we don't know what those effects are, but we're already sensing, not just in the world of entertainment, but all over, that they are going to be far-reaching. And whether ultimately they turn out to be far-reaching for good or ill, I think is anybody's guess. The scariest thing about it right now is that any idiot can write and sort of be taken seriously, have a venue, thanks to this thing. So you have, Sarah Palin talking about death squads, and when you talk about, and all this stuff is given credence, and you have 100 scientists saying that there is such a thing as global warming, and then you find out you have to give equal time, or somebody will seize equal time on the internet, because suddenly everybody has this megaphone in their hand. And I don't know about you, but I receive a lot of stuff on the internet which is balderdash. It's not true. It's complete BS. And sometimes you can track it down, but sometimes people send you the most ridiculous things. And where it's going to go and how it affects movies and how it affects is yet to be determined. But for example, one of the ways that movies were doing quite well until recently was DVD sales. DVD sales really propped up and was a big revenue source for movies. And DVD sales have flattened out, and now the next thing is, movies on demand, movies through your computer. So I can't really answer that question as to where this is going to finally wind up.
Hi. I saw Star Trek II when I was in 8th grade, and I think it's the first movie that ever made me cry. So I wanted to say thank you for that.
See, it's okay if they end unhappy. Would have made more money if Spock had lived.
That's right. Well, that's the thing I wanted to bring up is part of the power for that movie has always been, at least in more recent years, that and the movies subsequently, is that it seems to, in many ways, parallel the story of Jesus in terms of somebody from another world who gives his life to save a bunch of other people and then returns from death. And I was just wondering if that was any sort of conscious thought on your part, or was it just the drama of somebody ultimately giving his life on behalf of others that was the inspiration for the ending of the story?
Did you see that Superman movie, Superman Returns? I thought that was the best version, of the New Testament that I'd ever seen. I'm going to give you an honest answer. I was offered to direct Star Trek III. And I said, I don't know how to do Resurrection. I fought the ultimate ending. You read the book, you'll find out. I fought the ending of Star Trek II that suggests that he was going to come back. And that was added on very late in the making of the movie. In the original version of the movie, he dies. And there's no shot of the coffin on the planet or any sense that there's any other possibilities here. One of the things that I began to take very seriously while I didn't understand about Star Trek until I got involved in it. And then I thought, people take this very seriously. People care about this character. And are you telling me? And people said you can't kill Spock. I said, yeah, you can kill him. But you have to kill him well. It can't be perceived as the working out of some clause in Leonard Nimoy's contract. It's got to be organic. It's got to be part of the piece. It's got to be the raison d'etre of what's going on here. So if we do it, and then we say, what? This was just a dry hustle? We were just kidding, and he's coming back? I thought that was unforgivable to the audience. I started to take them very seriously. And I fought, and I lied. I stonewalled. I did a lot of things. Looking back on the finished movie 20 years, 30 years later, I thought, why were you making such a fuss? It's not such a big deal. What they wound up doing, maybe partially thanks to how strenuously I fought, was graceful and subtle. I did not have any part of 3. I didn't want to do that. That's not my thing. Let's leave it at that. But I'm glad you cried. I think it makes you a better person. And tears are good.
This is going to be the worst question that's asked tonight.
I'll give you the worst answer.
Because my brother and I have thought about this for years, and I promised I would ask this. So which is better, Star Trek 2 or Star Trek 6? I'm the master.
Better in what sense?
Which do you think, your opinion?
Well, you're asking me to choose among my children. But let me use your question as a springboard to talk about something. I think there is a great misunderstanding in this culture as to what the artist's relationship to his art really is. I am not the answer to a book of math problems at the back. Artists lose all proprietary authority over their creations once they're finished. My opinion means no more and possibly less than your brother's or anyone else's. Artists are people who put messages in bottles. When they're finished, they throw the bottle out into the water, and that's the last they see of it. They hope that someone will find the bottle and pop the cork and look at what's inside. But I'm not going to be there when that happens. I'm not going to be looking over their shoulder saying, no, that's not gum, that's gun. I can't shout at the back of the room while the movie's unspooling. This is what this means, and if you don't think you're wrong, there's that great line in The Producers where Kenneth Morris says, I am the author, I outrank you. But I don't outrank. I don't outrank anybody. So when I have done any of those commentaries, or when I have done any Q and answer session, when people say, what does it mean? Or which is better? I will also tell you there's no such word as definitive in a discussion of art of any kind. There is no definitive apple. Cézanne paints it one way, Zouberon paints it another way. It's not definitive. It's subjective. You can't get in the way of it. And my opinion is irrelevant. And when people say to me, why does Khan have one glove? I always say, why do you think he has one glove? I'm not the answer, and what I say, it would just be more speculation, except that you would give it more credit because it was coming from me, and I don't want that.
You're a writer and a director. And you've done both, obviously. Do those two people in you come into conflict when you're working on projects? Do they argue with each other, or do they work in harmony?
That's a really good question. I've thrown myself off the set several times, but I every time I turn around, there I am. The time I noticed this happening, going back to Star Trek 6, for those of you who have not seen Star Trek 6, I will say this: it is one swell movie, and I'm very proud of it. The Undiscovered Country. In that movie, which talks about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is called the Klingons in the movie, and Gorbachev, who is called Gorkon in the movie, because that was as close as we thought we could get to Gorbachev. I had a good conversation with my dentist when the movie was over. He said, God, I love that movie. And I said, how about we predicted the whole Soviet coup? We filmed it before it actually happened. And, and he said, what? And I said, well, the Russians have always, and the Klingons, and it's a long pause. And he said, I guess I'll have to see it again. Anyway, when I was writing that movie, and the movie deals with the assassination of a head of state in an outer space movie. And I thought, how do you assassinate someone in outer space? That would be cool. And I thought, it's interesting. Every time I see any of the Star Wars or the Star Trek movies, when they're walking around the spaceships, even Alien, they're always walking around and there's gravity. It's like they're in a Holiday Inn. But every time I see movies of the space shuttle and the space station, they're floating. So, am I to infer that at some point in the future, these spaceships will have gravity devices that centrifuges or something that simulate gravity? Okay, I can understand that. But then, how come in all those space battles when they're shooting at each other with the ray guns, that the gravity machine is never disabled? Now the hairs on the back of my neck are starting to rise. I think, I know how to kill him. We disable the gravity machine. Everybody starts to float helplessly, and guys with magnetic boots come around with their ray guns, and they shoot him, and then, oh God, floating blood. and I'm so excited. And at this point, the director taps me on the shoulder and says, "How are you going to do that?" And I remember there was one time where the writer threw the director out and said, "Go away, it's movies, we'll figure it," which is precisely what happened. So that is an attempt, at any rate, to explain my relationship with the two sides of myself when we're speaking.
Fondness for Sherlock Holmes. What are some of the other things that you sort of keep returning back to over and over?
Moby Dick, Huckleberry Finn, the plays of Shakespeare. I was a poor student. I was not a good student. And we would read Shakespeare in school, and I didn't get it. I never got anything, but I didn't get it. But I did have a crush on a movie actor. Well, he wasn't a movie actor, he was a stage actor. Laurence Olivier. had a big crush on Olivier. And I grew up in New York, land of everything, the best place in the world. And until I got here, anyway. I saw there was Laurence Olivier was appearing in a movie that was playing at one of these revival cinemas, and the name of the movie was Henry V. And I don't know if it actually even admitted that it was Shakespeare, but I went to see the movie because I liked him. So I saw him in Wuthering Heights and other stuff, and I thought it was very cool. And I had a religious experience. I discovered Shakespeare. And I also discovered that you're not supposed to read it. You're supposed to see it. You're supposed to hear it. And it's actually, I feel like I'm in analysis with like 50 analysts. This led to something very important for me. I said I am never again reading a Shakespeare play until I've seen it. So when I was here as an undergraduate, I saw my own theater department's production of King Lear. And I was the only person in the audience who didn't know what was going to happen next. And it remains the single greatest theatrical experience of my life. I was just, even all these years now, I can scarcely speak of it. So those were that Henry V thing and Shakespeare in general, because then I saw the Olivier Richard III, then I saw the Hamlet, then I saw the Franco Zeffirelli Romeo and Juliet, and so forth, the Ken Branagh Much Ado About Nothing, and also, by the way, I'll tell you the Mel Gibson Hamlet, which is brilliant. That's the only Hamlet where I ever wept, was that one. Those were, you're asking me for influences, childhood things that influence. Because normally I'm very suspicious of the question about what influenced you. Because half the time I think we don't know. We know what it sounds cool to say. I was very influenced by Hitchcock and Robert Bresson. It sounds good. Maybe even, it may be true, but it may not be all the truth. And some of the people who influenced me, teachers here, Howard Stein, Peter Arnott, Cosmo Catalan, they didn't even know they were, there was this person in the back of the room whose life was being changed. And as a kid, I can talk about discoveries rather than influences. When I was 5 years old, I discovered Mozart. And I said, okay, that's the best. I'm now 63. I have not changed my mind. I've added. I'm a slut. Everything is just added on. But I did not change my mind. I was like fully formed, for better or worse, by the time I was 13 years old or something.
Sorry.
I was just curious, in Star Trek II, since the movie had been shot, did you have concerns at how it was going to affect the flow of the movie when they looped the scene into the Vulcan language before you saw the final product?
You mean the scene between Savick and Spock in that? No, I always knew we were going to do that.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, that was always planned. And actually, for the record, it's not looped. They're talking. They're talking in that Vulcan thing, and we just put in the subtitles.
You mentioned previously that you've been disappointed with the special effects of Star Trek II, and I was just wondering, with the original series being re-released on DVD, they've gone through and modernized the special effects. So I was wondering if that's something you'd like to see done eventually with Wrath of Khan, or just leave as it, as is.
No, I don't like changing things. Should we cut out unfortunate sections of movies that deal with racial stereotypes from years before because we're now uncomfortable with them? Movies are many things, including history. And I think it's dangerous to rewrite history. They should be the record of what they are. I also, for the record, don't really like the so-called director's cut. I very seldom, I can think of exceptions because there are always exceptions, that a director's cut is better than the actual movie. Certainly the new version of Touch of Evil that Walter Murch did based on the Orson Welles notes is a much better movie than the butchery that Universal did on Orson Welles' original. But I don't think Amadeus is any better with 20 minutes added. I don't think that any of the Close Encounters that are added is better. And I've changed my movies a little bit when I got to do the DVD version, but I never let them call it the director's cut because it sounded like, like deceptive advertising, because I'm tweaking tiny little things that I lost battles with the studio that now suddenly they don't care about. So I get to put it right. So that with Star Trek II, they cut out the bit that the boy was Scotty's nephew. And then the plot didn't make any sense to me. Why is he so upset? So I put it back in, but it's not the director's cut. Come on. And so I don't. Do you take out a piece of a Beethoven string quartet because you think, oh, that's kind of boring or whatever? You don't do that. Just leave the record. Leave the record. There was somebody over here who had a question.
You mentioned, obviously, in the book and in your introduction that you didn't have an affinity for Star Trek.
I didn't know it.
Yeah. Do you think that allowed you to make such a successful film because you were coming with it, looking at it as more of a movie and motion picture instead of just another Star Trek lore in addition to it,
Maybe. I'm not really sure. It calls for a conclusion on the part of the artist, and I'm weak on that. I know that I saw the first movie and I saw some of the episodes, and I could see things that I didn't understand. So I tried to make a movie that I could understand. And the big breakthrough that I had with regard to Star Trek, this is all in the book, but don't skip the passage when you get to it. I'd appreciate that. Is that I woke up in the middle of the night saying, I know what this reminds me of that I really love. These books by C.S. Forrester that I used to read. Did you ever read the Captain Hornblower books, the English sea captain during the Napoleonic Wars, and he had a babe in every port, and there was lots of battles, and I thought, this is Hornblower in outer space. And that's what I set out to do, and that was my way in. Once I got Hornblower in space, I thought, this is all going to be a straight Navy show. And everything's going to be nautical, or as my wife said, nautical but nice. Yeah, you have to be at a university to make this joke, because I've tried it other places, and it's just like nothing. So I was very influenced by Hornblower. By the way, I found out that Gene Roddenberry was slightly influenced by Hornblower too, because I went and rewatched the Raoul Walsh, Gregory Peck Adventures of Captain Horatio Hornblower. The music for that is by an English light classics composer by the name of Robert Farnon. And you listen to the fanfare in that movie and you go, oh, he was a real fan of Hornblower, Gene Roddenberry.
Coming back to the day after, I didn't have the fortune of getting to see it the first go-around, having been too young at the time. I did have the fortune of living in Lawrence for a few years and meeting some of the people who'd been extras in the film, and I did get to see it later on. You've described making that film as being like a public service announcement rather than as a dramatic production. Do you feel like, judging it on those terms, that the public received it the way that you found satisfactory, or that it fell on deaf ears, the message of the film?
Well, I will tell you the following story. I sat watching the day after the night it aired with my girlfriend, subsequently wife, and I thought, who would sit through this? I cannot imagine anybody putting themselves through this. I was then astonished to learn the following morning that 100 million people had watched this movie, making it the most watched movie ever made for television, a record which, by the way, will probably not be broken because there's too many channels. So I win. Then the press, all ideas these days must be, how like vultures chew up the meat for their young before they pass it on? Now we have talking heads who do this with every idea. It's Sean Hannity and Keith Olbermann have all got to weigh in. So the press went running out the day after, and interviewed people with microphones and said, did this movie change your mind about nuclear war one way or the other? Yes or no? And then they came rather gleefully back to me and said, everybody says that your movie didn't change their mind one way or the other. What do you have to say to that? And I said, I think it's too early to say. Most people don't know what they really think anyway. You may think you know what you think. You may think you would like other people to think you think this. But I don't think anybody's mind gets changed overnight in the first place. And in the second place, I think they'd be damned if they admit it was changed by a TV movie, which sounds kind of dorky. So I think there's going to be some time. But I was wrong in one case, because one person's mind was changed overnight by the day after, and that was the President of the United States. Ronald Reagan saw this movie. He had come to office believing in a winnable nuclear war. 20 million acceptable casualties. If we have enough shovels, we'll be okay. And I was giving a talk at Oxford. That's a good thing to say. I was giving a talk at Oxford, and a kid came up to me and he said, have you read Ronald Reagan's memoirs? And I said, no, I had not. And he produced a Xeroxed copy of one page, in which essentially Ronald Reagan allows that the day after changed his mind about a winnable nuclear war. And in fact, in the wake of his epiphany, he went to Reykjavik, met with Gorbachev, and to the fury of a lot of fellow Republicans, signed the Intermediate Range Missile Treaty. I also subsequently met Edmund Morris. Edmund Morris, among other things, is the author of the Pulitzer Prize winning Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. But he also was Reagan's official biographer. And by official, I mean that Reagan invited him to live in the White House and watch everything for, I think, a period of 3 years. And he eventually wrote a rather notorious biography called Dutch, which is not a bad book, but it is tainted by the fact that for whatever reason, Morris invented himself as a fictional character in Reagan's life. I don't exactly know how that was supposed to work. But in both the Dutch biography and Edmund Morris talking to me personally, he said the only time he ever saw Ronald Reagan get upset, really distressed, was after he saw The Day After. So I changed one person's mind for sure. And in that sense, to date, because I'm still standing, that's the most useful thing I ever got to do with my life so far.
Thank you so much. We want to leave time for him to sign books as well, so you'll be here for a while to sign some books.
I will sign every book.